Hi, my name is Ann Battle, and I'm head of benchmark reform at ISDA. And I'm joined today by Deepak Sitlani from Linklaters and Lansing Gottrell and Sherry Kriskanal from IHS Markit. On this webinar, we're going to cover the bilateral templates that ISDA has published for counterparties to use in implementing the IBOR fallback. This webinar will also cover how to negotiate and agree to those templates on ISDA Create, as well as the Outreach360 service provided by IHS Markit for firms to engage with their counterparties on implementation of the new fallback. So this is the third in a series of 3 webinars published in connection with the launch of the ISDA IBOR fallback documentation. We encourage you to go back and listen to the first 2 webinars if you haven't done so already. As mentioned, this webinar is intended to assist market participants in understanding the bilateral forms of amendment and template language that ISDA has produced for counterparties who either adhere to the ISDA IBOR fallback protocol but want to supplement it with additional agreements, or who choose to agree to incorporate the new IBOR fallback in their legacy documents bilaterally as opposed to via the protocol. In particular, we'll give an explanation of each of the form of amendment agreements, as well as the template wording and how that template wording can be used within the amendment agreements or otherwise. And we'll go through a few examples of how and why counterparties might want to use these templates. Then we'll talk about using them on ISDA Create, as I mentioned, and Sherry and Lansing will go through the IHS Markit Outreach 360 service. I'm going to start by talking about the forms of amendment agreement that we've published, and then turn it over to Deepak to talk about some of the template language that could be used within these forms of an amendment agreement. So this slide covers the amendment agreements that counterparties could use to bilaterally adopt the protocol. And as we've covered in a separate webinar, the protocol is really no different than a standard amendment, except it allows for agreement to the amendment multilaterally, that is, with all counterparties who also adhere to the protocol, as opposed to bilaterally. So these templates are meant for counterparties if one or both of the counterparties, for whatever reason, does not adhere to the protocol, but those counterparties still have legacy IBOR transactions for which they need the new fallback. We've published a short form and a long form of this amendment agreement, and for each of the short form and the long form, we've published a version that could be used if one of the counterparties is an agent that is agreeing to the amendments on behalf of underlying clients, and a form that could be used if both parties are entering into the agreement as principals. The short form enables counterparties to incorporate by reference the amendments made by the protocol in exactly their same form. So if counterparties uses the short form and don't add any different modifications or supplemental language, then they will have effectuated exactly the same thing as they would have effectuated if both of them adhere to the protocol, but they're able to do so bilaterally if one of them chooses not, or one or both of them chooses not to adhere to the protocol. It's also possible, using the short form of the amendment agreement, to agree to supplemental terms that we'll come on to in a few minutes. The long form actually contains the entire text of the amendment provisions, which are in the attachment to the protocol. So in this long form of the amendment agreement, counterparties could, if they chose to, modify the terms of those amendments as they agree to them bilaterally. They could also add additional supplemental terms based on the template language that we're going to talk about, or other supplemental provisions that they want to add to this bilateral agreement. So the long form is much longer, and in some cases will include provisions that are not applicable, but it does allow for more flexibility. Another thing that counterparties could do with the long form would be to remove some of the non-applicable provisions if that is more desirable or easier to negotiate with a counterparty that only needs these amendments for a narrow scope of transactions. So the final form of amendment agreement that we published is actually for two counterparties who have both adhered to the protocol. So they've agreed to the protocol, they've agreed to all of the terms in the attachment to the protocol. So their legacy contracts with each other have the fallbacks, but they might want to use some of the supplemental language that DPAC is going to cover. And to do so, they need to agree to that language bilaterally. They could do so in a form of side letter that they produce and are comfortable with themselves. But in order to facilitate those supplemental agreements, we've published this form of amendment agreement that basically contains the wrapper language you'd typically see in a bilateral amendment agreement and some boilerplate. This form of amendment agreement is also set up to make it easy for counterparties to agree to some of the supplemental terms in the template language that we're going to talk about. And like everything we're covering today, this will be available on ISDA Create. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Deepak to talk about the template language.
Great, thanks, Anne. So I'm going to kick off with probably the most complicated form of template language. And so this is language that is there to exclude agreements or transactions from the scope of the amendments made by the protocol, and so effectively removing documents from scope, and for those documents that are removed from scope, agreeing to bespoke fallbacks. So this set of template provisions, as I say, is the most complicated, and the reason for that is there are various options within the template, and this was because we felt that there might well be different ways in which people may want to exclude documents from scope. And as we go through, you'll see that they're all variations on a theme, but what we wanted to do was to try and do as much of the work for users of the template provisions so that we could make their lives a little bit easier. And it may well be that actually the majority of users just use the most simple option. But let me run you through those so that you can get a feel for what they do. So the first option is the most simple, and what it does is it allows parties to exclude from the scope of the protocol a set of identified documents, and then in their place they can apply alternative triggers or fallbacks for those documents. Now, if they do that, it's for the parties to decide what those alternative triggers and fallbacks are. One thing I would say is that this template, as with the others, can be used with either of the amendment agreements that Anne mentioned. And so to the extent that it's being used with an amendment agreement which contemplates the parties having already adhered to the protocol, then the effect of removing documents from scope is effectively reversing the change made pursuant to the protocol. So it doesn't mean that the change wasn't made by the protocol. It just means that having made the change pursuant to the protocol, the parties are now reversing that. So the second option within this template allows parties to, again, exclude the protocol from applying to an identified set of documents. And then it allows parties to contemplate that the floating rate option within those identified documents will instead track the approach taken to the benchmark in an underlying cash instrument. So this is really for people who want their derivative contract to follow the cash instrument that derivative contract is likely to be hedging. And so you have the ability within this option to nominate multiple documents that are taken out of scope from the protocol. And then for each one of those documents, you can identify what's known as a reference contract, which is ultimately the cash instrument that derivative is looking to hedge. You have the third option within this template, which allows parties, again, to exclude the protocol applying to a range of documents. But this range of documents are those that contain what are known as negotiated fallbacks. So the definition of negotiated fallbacks is for the parties to populate. So it could be that they describe what they consider to be negotiated fallbacks in whatever way they see fit. There is also optional language within this template to contemplate negotiated fallbacks being a provision that already contemplates what should happen upon the occurrence of a permanent cessation or a LIBOR rate not being representative. Option 4 effectively combines option 1 and 3. So this allows you to exclude documents from scope, as well as exclude documents that have negotiated fallbacks, and in their place, you can contemplate alternative triggers and fallbacks. And option 5 essentially combines options 1, 2, and 3. So you can exclude the protocol from applying to identified documents, as well as documents which contain negotiated fallbacks, and also then contemplate alternative triggers and fallbacks, as well as contemplating that a floating rate option will track the approach taken in a cash instrument that is being hedged. So you'll see, as I mentioned, it's just variations on a theme in terms of how you can combine the different options together depending on how you want to use the template. So that's all I had on that template. So if we move forward to the next set of template provisions, the first one on the slide is one that allows parties to include additional documents within the scope of the protocol. And so this is a relatively simple piece of language that allows parties to identify additional documents, as I say, that they want to have within scope. The next template set of provisions allows parties to disapply the pre-cessation trigger. So as was covered in an earlier webinar, the pre-cessation trigger is hardwired into the protocol for LIBOR rate options, and it applies when the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, announces that LIBOR is not representative and that the representativeness will not be restored. And so if you do not want that trigger to apply, i.e. if you only want within your contract a permanent cessation trigger to apply, then you can use this template to remove that trigger. The last protocol, the last template on this slide contemplates being used with new documents. And so this is, for example, where you have a new document that does not include or incorporate the 2006 definitions, or otherwise contemplate a rate option as defined in the 2006 definitions. And so here, effectively, what you can do is apply the terms of paragraph 5 or 6 of the attachment to the protocol, so that you can import the fallbacks. But equally, if you want to disapply the pre-cessation trigger, then that is also an option within this set of provisions. So then the final template, just set of provisions to talk about, is a set of provisions that can be used for new confirmations. And so by new confirmations, I mean confirmations that incorporate the 2006 definitions once the supplement, the fallback supplement, has been published. Because when the supplement is published, then the new trades will effectively incorporate the pre-cessation trigger as well as the permanent cessation trigger. And so if parties at confirmation level want to disapply that pre-cessation trigger, then they can do so using this template language. So with that, I'll hand over to Anne just to run through or start running us through some examples as to how these templates can be used.
Thanks, Deepak. I know that was a lot of information with a lot of different options, so we thought we would go through on the next few slides a few examples of, as I mentioned at the beginning, how and why counterparties might want to use these templates. So I'm going to start with a few examples of how counterparties who have not adhered to the protocol could use these templates. And these examples would apply equally if only one of the parties had adhered to the protocol, because as covered on a separate webinar, the amendments made by the protocol only apply if both of the counterparties adhere to the protocol. So the first example A on this slide is very straightforward. Party A and Party B have not adhered to the protocol, but they want to bilaterally adopt it. And both of them are principals. They're not, they haven't entered into the ISDA master agreement as principals. And this might be the case because in this example, they have one ISDA master agreement that would be a protocol covered document. And so maybe they don't want to use the protocol because they're only amending one document, as opposed to some market participants who have hundreds or thousands of protocol covered documents. So in this case, the counterparties could effectuate exactly what they want to do by using the short form template form of agreement and the principal version of that. So by agreeing to that template and its published form, they would apply the new fallbacks to the transactions entered into under their ISDA master agreement. So in example B on this slide, we also have Party A and Party B who have not adhered to the protocol. But in this case, they have a credit support annex for variation margin, which doesn't incorporate a relevant ISDA definitional booklet, but does reference US dollar LIBOR. So as mentioned on a prior webinar, this reference to US dollar LIBOR would be amended by the protocol to include the new fallbacks because the CSA is a protocol covered document. And they want to agree to the fallbacks for that reference to US dollar LIBOR, but they don't want paragraphs 1 through 5 of the attachment to the protocol because none of the terms of those paragraphs are applicable to this agreement, and they'd rather just not have so many non-applicable terms in their bilateral amendment. So as mentioned earlier, if counterparties use the long form of the amendment agreement, then they can remove non-applicable provisions. So in this case, counterparties could implement the fallbacks in their legacy CSA by using the long form template form of agreement and removing paragraphs 1 through 5. And in this example, Party A is an agent that has entered into the CSA on behalf of underlying clients. So they would use the agency version of the long form amendment. So on this slide in example C, we're going to move on to something slightly more complicated, but we're also in a scenario where Party A and Party B have not adhered to the protocol. They want to adopt the terms of the protocol, so they want to implement the new fallbacks in their legacy transactions, but they want to do so with a few modifications. And specifically, as mentioned in Romanet 1 and Romanet 2, they want to exclude one particular swap confirmation that was entered into to hedge a loan. And in this case, that loan has its own fallbacks that they want to match. They also, when applying the new fallbacks to their legacy transactions, want to disapply the pre-cessation trigger. And as we've mentioned on a prior webinar and as Deepak just covered, the pre-cessation trigger is for LIBOR rate options, so references to LIBOR in documentation, and it provides for a move to the fallback rates if the UK FCA determines that LIBOR is non-representative, even if LIBOR does not cease at that time. So in this case, Party A and Party B do not want to move to fallbacks at that time. They instead want to move to fallbacks only if a permanent cessation of LIBOR occurs. So in this case, because the counterparties are supplementing the amendments made by the protocol as opposed to modifying or removing any of them, they could use the short form template form of amendments. But in doing so, to accomplish the two other objectives that they had, they would include the template wording to exclude the confirmation they have for the loan or the confirmation for the swap that hedges the loan. And in doing so, they would use option 2 that Deepak talked about, which provides that for that particular swap, instead of including the new fallbacks that are being implemented via the IBOR fallback supplement and IBOR fallback protocol, the fallbacks that apply to that particular swap will be the fallbacks that apply to the loan in the documentation for the hedged loan. And then they would also add to that short form of amendments the template language for disapplying the pre-cessation triggers and fallbacks for LIBOR. So I'm now going to turn it back to Deepak to go through a few more examples.
Great, thanks, Anne. So the next example is one where the parties have already adhered to the protocol and they have an existing master agreement, so not an ISDA master agreement, but some other form of master agreement that is not within the scope of the protocol. So you may well remember that the protocol covers a number of non-ISDA master agreements and credit support documents, but it just so happens in this case that the two parties are parties to a master agreement that is not within scope of those additional master agreements either. And what they want to do is extend the application of the protocol to cover that master agreement. So the way in which they can do that is to use the template wording that I touched on earlier, which allows parties to include additional existing documents to the scope of the application of the protocol. And they can do that in whatever form they want, but if they choose to, they can use the template form of language that ISDA has published. So the next example is where Party A and Party B are about to enter into a new master agreement. That master agreement won't incorporate the 2006 definitions, but they nevertheless want to be sure that the terms of the protocol will apply, so that if there are transactions entered into under that master agreement, then the permanent cessation fallbacks will apply, but they're not keen on the pre-cessation provisions that otherwise apply to LIBOR rate options. So in that example, what the parties can do is they can take the template provisions that allow parties to apply the terms of the protocol to new agreements that don't incorporate the 2006 definitions, and also within that language they can make the election to disapply the pre-cessation trigger. So here, given that they are entering into a new agreement, they may well just look to drop those template provisions into the new agreement itself. The next example is where you have two parties who are entering into a new interest rate swap. So in this example that references Swiss franc LIBOR, and they are going to incorporate the 2006 definitions, but what they want to do is disapply the pre-cessation provisions. So remember that this is in a scenario where the ISDA IBOR fallback supplement has been published. And so automatically, by virtue of incorporating the 2006 definitions in relation to a LIBOR rate option, both the permanent cessation and the pre-cessation provisions would apply. So if they want to disapply the pre-cessation aspect of that, then they can use the template wording for use with confirmations that incorporate the 2006 definitions, and effectively just drop that into the new confirmation that they are entering into. So I'll finish off the examples with one more complicated example where parties are trying to do a variety of things in one go. So here the example is where Party A and Party B have already adhered to the protocol, and they have some master agreements that are protocol covered master agreements, and they have some existing master agreements that are not protocol covered documents. And they are both acting as principals. So now what they want to do is exclude one of their protocol covered master agreements from scope of the protocol. They want to bring into play two other master agreements that are not currently within scope of the protocol. And for 4 of the protocol covered master agreements that they have, they want to disapply the pre-cessation provisions in the protocol. So they want to do a number of things. And so the way in which they can do that is, firstly, because we're in a situation where the parties have already adhered to the protocol, they can use the template form of amendment that is relevant where parties have adhered to the protocol and want to update in relation to existing agreements. And then they can drop in various template provisions. So the first one being to exclude documents from scope and then identify the protocol covered master agreement that they want to exclude. They can then drop in the template provision that allows for the scope of the protocol to be extended to cover additional documents. So in relation to the 2 master agreements that would not otherwise be protocol covered documents. And then finally, they can include the template wording to disapply the pre-cessation trigger for those 4 protocol covered documents or protocol covered master agreements where they want those provisions to be disapplied. So I think with that, we'll finish up with the examples. And I'm conscious that what we've done is deliberately to try and come up with a number of permutations just so that you can get a feel for how the template amendment agreements as well as the template language can be used in conjunction. So that's very much a mix and match type approach. And so the next thing I'd like to talk about is to create. And so we're very mindful that whilst protocol adherence is definitely the easy way to apply the new fallbacks, that for various reasons it may well be that parties would like to make bilateral arrangements, and hence the publication of those bilateral documents we've just been talking about. But equally, we're mindful that there are a number of parties out there who have agreements in place. So ISDA Create allows for a relatively smooth process in order to get those bilateral agreements in place. So at a very high level, ISDA Create was first launched in 2019, and it was focused on the regulatory initial margin documents. But recently, ISDA announced that the breadth or the scope of documents that would be covered by ISDA Create would be broadening. And for our purposes, what's relevant is that they would be capturing the interest rate reform documents that ISDA has published and may well continue to publish. So there are 4 key elements to the platform. So the first one is the platform allows you to generate documents. So you can do that by creating templates and in a very easy way, and I'll come on to show you in a minute what that looks like. You can basically produce documents in a very quick and easy way. once you've produced documents, you can negotiate them online. And so that allows parties to exchange comments between each other, and to the extent necessary black line changes that are required. And once you get to a position that the document is agreed, then you can have that document signed. And so within the platform, you have an approvals process, because it may well be that negotiators need to seek specific approval from other colleagues, and so that can be built into the platform. And once you've done that, you can then have a full audit trail of both comments as well as approvals for any particular negotiation. And then finally, and for me, this has always been a really important piece of the platform, you can capture the data that comes out of it. So this allows you to generate reports that relate to all of the data that is within the agreement, including all of the approvals process. And you've got a 100% accurate set of data that you can then use to operationalize downstream. So I'll just show you very quickly some of the other slides on how the platform works. So this is the dashboard, which is basically the hub for users of the platform, and it gives you a bird's eye view of all negotiations. And it basically gives you a high level of management information as to who's doing what's the status of particular negotiations. So for example, how much is in my court versus how much is in my counterparty's court. And it's an interactive dashboard, so you can drill down by clicking on any of the analytics features and you just get more detail. And equally, if you want to, you can export all of the data into an Excel file. So then if we move to the next slide, you can see this is a screenshot of the automation and negotiation piece. So the first time you go through a document, you can then effectively save it as a preset or as a template, if you like, and then you can use it for a number of negotiations. And if need be, you can produce documents and send them out in bulk, as may well be relevant for rate reform. So what this shows you is a split screen format. So for those of you who are very familiar with working with documents, you'll see that on the right-hand side, but you interact with the elections on the left-hand side. And as soon as you click, so for example, if you click that the repeating representations are applicable, then as soon as you do that, the document will update in real time on the right-hand side. And the status bar at the top shows you how close to agreement you are. So here you have a negotiation where 38% of the elections have been agreed. And so obviously there's a little bit of a way to go before that document is finalized. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see another example of an election. And I guess just to flag that one thing that you can do is, if, for example, this election is not agreed, for example, you can go and get approvals to get the relevant permission to agree to this election. If we move to the next slide, I touched on data earlier. So for me, if you document this contracts using this platform, then effectively all of the data is caught at the time of creating the contract. And so all of the data is also captured in a very structured way. So you can basically take every single election and analyze, for example, how many contracting counterparties have made that particular election as well. So this happens automatically. So it's immediate, and there is no risk of incorrect data transposition, which is obviously the risk that people run nowadays, where after an agreement is executed, someone then has to put the data into their system. So here, and a number of users have already plugged into APIs that can leverage the data from here and downstream it into other systems. So I guess just finally to finish, that if you do need any more information on ISDA Create, then on this next slide we have the contact information if you do need any more data. So that's isdacreate@isda.org or isdacreate@nakoda.ai. So Anne, I'll stop there if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, and as a reminder, all of the bilateral templates are available for negotiation on ISDA Create, and you'll be able to add the template language we talked to the forms of agreement, which will hopefully make any negotiations a little bit more seamless than they would have been via paper. So for the last part of this webinar, I'm going to turn it over to Lansing and Sherry from IHS Markit to talk about their Outreach 360 services.
Thanks, Anne. So this is Lansing Cottrell. Hello, everyone. I'm here with my colleague, Sherry Kurasinkel. As part of the launch of the ISDA IBOR fallback protocol, we're happy to help with this webinar on options firms have to facilitate their counterparties adhering to the protocol. As many of you know, for the past 8 years, IHS Markit and ISDA have been in a partnership known as ISDA Amend, whose stated goal is to streamline the implementation of protocols across the industry after a counterparty decides to adhere. ISDA Amend does this by automating the dissemination of counterparty-specific attestations, elections, carve-outs, etc., as they relate to relevant protocols. Now, today, we will be talking about an additional service known as Outreach 360. This also helps streamline the implementation of protocols across the industry, but by engaging a counterparty before as opposed to after adhering to the protocol. Outreach 360 does this by providing the counterparty with educational content, guidelines, and contractual impact assessments to highlight to the counterparty the benefits of protocol adherence. And yet the end goal of Outreach 360 and ISDA Amend is the same: maximize the number of counterparties adhering to the protocol and provide granular details on which clients will adhere, which ones will not, and why. To illustrate this point, we thought we would compare some of the more widely adopted protocols over time. This slide shows the number of adhering counterparties to the Dodd-Frank protocols and the ISDA protocol. We wanted to highlight the ISDA protocol because it was the first protocol where a large group of banks utilized our Outreach 360 tool to encourage their counterparties to adhere. The graph here shows on the left how Dodd-Frank 1 and 2 quickly increased to around 12,000 adhering counterparties in the first 18 months before the growth in adherence started leveling off somewhat. But after 8 years, the total number of adherents for Dodd-Frank 1 and 2 stood at close to 25,000 counterparties. By contrast, the ISDA protocol, we contracted with 8 banks to use our Outreach 360 tool in a coordinated outreach campaign. As you can see in the graph on the right, the resulting uptake was dramatic. It took only 18 months for the ISDA protocol to clock 25,000 adhering counterparties. Now, obviously, there are many factors behind the successful adoption of the ISDA, but we believe that one of the key factors was the coordinated communication by our staff using Outreach 360 to contact over 50% of all adhering counterparties on behalf of 8 banks. So what is Outreach 360? Outreach 360 is an agnostic client communication tool that sits within our counterparty manager ecosystem, just like ISDA Amend does. For IBOR transition, it is currently being used by broker-dealers to manage the client communication campaigns regarding their respective IBOR transition plans, both in the OTC derivatives market per the ISDA protocol, as well as other client verticals like loans and fixed income that are impacted by the transition. This is possible because Outreach 360 is a versatile platform. It can support one-way communication, such as education material on links to the protocol, or even a link encouraging firms to use ISDA Create on a bilateral basis. Questionnaires can be sent out to collect necessary operational and regulatory data. Confirmation or attestation from the counterparty on their status or intention can be collected. And even the distribution of amendments to bilateral loans that counterparties can then redline and sign electronically on this platform. In terms of track record, Outreach360 has been in use for over 3 years now across a wide array of regulatory use cases, from SFTR and MiFID II to the US state protocols previously mentioned. It has been used by 19 global and regional banks across APAC, EMEA, and North America, and we are excited to bring this experience and track record to assist our clients in making the ISDA IBOR protocol a smashing success. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Sherry Kurasinkel to describe and show the nuts and bolts of how Outreach360 will operate with the upcoming protocol.
Thank you, Lansing. In addition to what Lansing mentioned around the capabilities of Outreach360, we just wanted to talk a little bit about where the technology and the service can come together to provide an outcome-focused solution for the broker community. In general, it starts with working on population analysis and cleaning that entity reference data to ensure that the entity population and the contact population are married together for clean outreach. Then it includes reaching out to the client with notification, engagements, educational material, letting them know what is happening with the IBOR protocol and how they can conduct the next steps either with the ISDA protocol or any bilateral outreach. IHS Markit's managed service monitors that adherence and looks at the bank's demand list against the protocol adherence and marries those two together. And where clients have not adhered to the protocol and haven't provided any feedback, the system will continue to chase at a defined frequency to ensure that there's consistent outreach and consistent client touchpoints. Where a client provides feedback saying that they would like to have a different approach, whether a bilateral template, Outreach360 can direct them to ISDA create for those bilateral templates, or send them separate non-standard bilateral documents for redlining and negotiation. And finally, all of this information, all of this data, all of this reporting can be piped through back to the bank through Excel reports and an API. Here you're seeing the landing page of the Outreach360 dashboard for the broker. The whole concept of Outreach360 was around auditability and mass reporting when you're sending out thousands to tens of thousands of emails to multiple counterparties. Of the many features, one of the things that's key in this item is our email management functionality. So we start with our email templates. And our email templates are full, there's a full HTML builder on the platform that allows you to customize your email to have exactly the look and feel per your individual bank's brand guidelines. Within the email, you can see an HTML builder on the left and a text builder on the right. And within the email, we allow the ability to add dynamic tags to the email. And the dynamic tags can reference individual counterparty entity reference data, which will populate onto the email dynamically to give you a more customized email approach. This functionality is easily adjustable by any user of the platform. Once we've created an email template, we can go into a campaign. And in this example of a campaign, I'll just walk you through what an outreach campaign generally looks like. To start with, there are these 7 chevrons, and the chevrons really guide you through what a setup process looks like between general campaign details, the entity selection, so you can select for that outreach campaign as you're reaching out to people for the ISDA protocol, you can select all of your counterparty entities that are relevant as part of this outreach. You can tag the outreach to specific users so you know which users, which counterparties are going to get that outreach. From a content selection perspective, you can send out educational documentation such as PDFs to your counterparty to let them know the impact of the IBOR protocol, or you can send them links directly into ISDA's website, and we'll show that in a second. And finally, you get to add that email, that customized email to this campaign, which goes out and you can review and submit it. Now, one of the cool features about Outreach360 when we think about mass outreach is that control function. You want to make sure that what you're sending out is what is expected from an outreach perspective. And so we have this email management functionality that allows you to export everything in Excel and make sure that the receivers that you are expecting are exactly the receivers that should be getting this communication. You can also preview the mail in an HTML format to see what is actually going out. And when you're comfortable with that particular outreach, you can send that email to the receivers. The whole point of Outreach360 is to do a lot of that heavy uplift that you normally would have to do manually with teams of outreach personnel. This is organizing the data for you and managing a lot of the manual outreaches and tracking. One final thing I'd like to show. Here is an example of an email that would have gone out for the US state protocol, and we can apply this kind of idea to the IBOR protocol. Within the wording, as you can see, the name of the institution has been dynamically generated into the email. And in addition to that, we are linking the ISDA protocol onto this email. So in this case, it's the US state protocol. If I click on it, it will take the user directly to the protocol, and they can go ahead and adhere. For those links, we can include click tracking. So you can tell how your users are engaging with those emails to see if you do have the right contacts. And if you find that through the metrics that we can generate for you on Outreach360, if you find that certain users are non-responsive, it gives you exactly the right data you need to adjust course.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I wanted to conclude this by letting everyone know where they can find additional information about the ISDA IBOR fallback documentation. The links on this website will give you information about background documents that ISDA has published for educational purposes, as well as links to the actual ISDA IBOR fallback supplement protocol and the bilateral templates that we've gone through today. If you have questions, please email benchmarkreform@isda.org or any of the other email addresses for specific purposes that we've covered today. Thank you.